Chapter 9. The Prosecutor from Nebraska. District Attorney Benjamin Pilson arrived in Black Deer Falls on September 24th, 6 days after the killings of Steve and his parents. He was 6'2" with a straight back and a fine haircut, and he blew into town with a mind to take charge of an investigation he viewed as having been poorly handled by the small-town local authorities. He wasn't wrong about that exactly. My dad and the deputies had made no headway with Murray, and the evidence from the Carlson house hadn't yielded any new clues about the killer or his methods, but you would have thought Pilson was the lead federal investigator from the way he burst into my dad's station, all necktie and stiff handshakes. He didn't pay much attention to Bert, and he was downright charming to Nancy, leaning over her desk and complimenting the big gold brooch she wore every Wednesday. As for me, sweeping quietly in the back, I might as well have been invisible. Until later, when he had a use for me, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man Benjamin Pilson really was. My dad took Pilson into his office, but he didn't close the door. It was hard to slide up with my broom and overhear what they were saying. Turns out he had come to try and take Murray. "We'd like to get her down to trial in Nebraska," he said. "I'm sure you would," my dad replied. "And I'm sure you will, eventually. But from what I understand, you have the best shot right here. A suspect found at the scene of the crime, covered in blood, and a room full of finger and shoe prints." "That is true. You and your deputies are owed more than a cold beer. I hope you'll let me buy you one on behalf of the citizens of Nebraska." "Thank you," my dad said. "I'm sure Charlie and Bert won't say no to that." "Were they the first on the scene?" Pilson asked. "Charlie and myself. We secured Mrs. Hale and the surviving minor children and conducted an initial search of the premises." "It must have been harrowing. I've heard you were acquainted with the victims?" "I was, and I don't mind telling you it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do." Pilson paused. "So it was just you and Deputy Charles Morrison," my dad supplied, joined shortly by Minnesota State Police. There was a beat of silence. My dad's tone was losing its ease. "I wish you'd found a murder weapon," Pilson said finally. "So do I," my dad said, "but no one has that I've heard of." "I heard you had some trouble out there the other night, some local boys compromising the scene." My broom froze in my hands. "I don't know how you heard that, Mr. Pilson, but the scene has already been processed, and I don't know what your hurry is. Nebraska will have its turn just like Wisconsin and Iowa." "Wisconsin can't place her at the scene, not so much as a footprint, and I spoke to the Iowa prosecutor this morning, and he's happy to continue their investigation while I take a run at it first. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I want to work in conjunction with you." "From Lincoln?" "Yes, from Lincoln." I heard the creak of my dad's chair as he leaned back. "I think we'd like to keep her here." There was a pause, and Pilson asked, "What have you gotten out of her? A name? A motive?" "As for a name, only her own." "Marie Catherine Hale," said Pilson. "We had no luck tracking down anyone with that name either, but we're working on it. She's probably from Nebraska after all, since Nebraska is where this all started." He'd been right about that, even if he didn't truly know it then. He was thinking of the first known victim at that time, Peter Knupp from Loop City. "I'd like to meet with the prisoner," Pilson said. "Of course." I quickly moved away as my dad got up to show Mr. Pilson to the interrogation room. This time Pilson noticed me, and after an appraising glance, he shot me a fast, hard wink. "Bert," my dad said, "will you please bring Miss Hale to speak with the Nebraska District Attorney?" Bert went up and got her, and on her way through the station she looked at me. Then he escorted her outside. "Kind of a pretty thing, isn't she?" Pilson asked. "Barely more than a child," said my dad. "Has she seemed traumatized, frightened? Has she given any explanation for her involvement?" "She hasn't said much of anything." Pilson walked in and closed the door. I wish I could have listened, but every eye in the station was on the interrogation room. And anyway, it wasn't long before Marie started to shout. "You can't do that, you dirty bastard! I didn't do anything! I didn't do it!" Nancy and I looked at each other. Nancy had her hand to her mouth. Marie had been so calm and quiet since the night of the murders. After another minute, Pilson came out and straightened his tie while Marie continued to wail and curse. "What on earth did you do?" my dad asked. "She'll calm down," Pilson replied. He held out his hand, and my dad, ever polite, shook it. "I'll see you in St. Paul in a few days, Sheriff Jensen. I've arranged a special hearing with the district court." He glanced back at the interrogation room and the screaming girl inside. "You'll have some peace and quiet again after I take her with me to Lincoln." And then he strode out of the building, leaving my dad to clean up the mess. "She won't quit," Bert called as he tried to call Marie. "Sheriff!" My dad reached for his handcuffs. "Not the cuffs, Rick," Nancy objected. "It's only for a minute. We can't have her injuring herself." He went in and we listened to them wrestle, to Marie screeching into my dad's voice, always steady, telling her he wasn't going to hurt her. Pretty soon it was quiet except for her breathing and birds. "What did he say to you?" my dad asked. "That upset you so?" I crept closer until I could see her, hands cuffed to the table, half standing and arms taut against the bonds like a horse trying to pull free. She looked right at me. "He wants to try me for felony murder." "But you didn't kill anyone," I said. "Did you?" "No." At the time, we didn't know that in Nebraska, a person could be convicted of felony murder even if they were not the one with their hand on the knife or their finger on the trigger. Nor did we know that such a conviction could result in a penalty of death. We thought that Pilson was just blowing smoke. "If you're innocent, it would go easier if you tell us what happened," my dad said. "Just explain it to us, piece by piece, even if you can't give us his name." Marie closed her eyes and shook her head fiercely. "He wants to kill me," she kept saying. "He wants to kill me." "You have to defend yourself, Miss Hale, or we can't help you." She opened her eyes. "I'll tell him," she said and nodded to me. "What, you mean Michael?" "Yes, Michael. I'll tell him everything, but only Michael." Chapter 10. The District Courthouse. I thought I'd misheard. Marie Catherine Hale, the only witness and presumed accomplice to the killing spree that had frozen the entire country, chose me to hear her story. "Absolutely not," my dad said to me when we got home. "But why?" my mom asked. My dad and I turned. We hadn't seen her standing in the kitchen, the glasses that usually hung around her neck perched on the end of her nose, using her thumb to hold her place in a novel. "What?" my dad asked. "And how do you know about it already?" "Nancy called me from the station. She said that Michael is the only one that the girl's been willing to talk to." "Nancy." My dad put his hand on his hips and shook his head like he was going to give her an earful, but we knew he would do no such thing. He looked at my mom. "You can't want him to do this." "Didn't you tell me last night that you weren't getting anywhere?" "That's not the point." He glanced at me and spoke in a low whisper. "The things he would have to hear. He's just a boy." "I'm 17, I said. Then they looked at me and I looked at the floor. "You weren't inside that house," my dad said. "You didn't see those bodies." "He won't have to see, though, will he? Just to hear?" "If we agree to this, it'll amount to a confession, and he'll be privy to the entire investigation. Blood evidence, autopsy reports, the photographs of the Carlsons, and the rest of the murders, too." My mom paled. She hadn't thought of that. Honestly, I hadn't either. But I would be lying if I said I didn't want to do it. I wanted to see, and I wanted to hear, and I wanted to be the first to know. Even then, I knew that Marie's confession was the story of a lifetime, the interview any reporter in the country would have killed for. "Linda," my dad said, "you don't want him to see all that, do you?" I didn't dare move a muscle while she thought about it, afraid to look too young and make her say no, afraid to seem too eager and make her say no for a different reason. "If that's what she wants," my mom said, "and the judge says it's all right, then who are we to say he can't? She deserves to confess, doesn't she, if she played a part in it? And Bob and Sarah and Stephen, don't they deserve it too?" My dad's shoulders slumped. After that, getting the other officials to sign on was easy. Mr. Porter reviewed the request, and after determining that it didn't violate any of Marie's rights, He agreed to advocate for her at the district court hearing from that Nebraska DA Pilsen had set up. Our prosecutor had also gave the okay, and a little surprisingly, so did the DAs from Wisconsin and Iowa. I didn't know them and have never seen their pictures, but in my imagination they look a lot like Mr. Porter. Balding and tired around the eyes, long past dreams of courtroom glory. But what it really was that none of them really wanted Marie. They wanted him, the one who the search teams and state patrols were still looking for, the one who might kill still more. When Mr. Pilsen heard about the confession, he dismissed it as a joke, though it was later heard from a woman who worked at the St. Paul Hotel where he was staying that he smashed the telephone down so hard he cracked it. Benjamin Pilsen was not about to let a girl's whims derail his plans. He was the fire and brimstone sort, firmly on the punishment side of the punishment versus rehabilitation argument. He was not swayed by Marie's youth, nor by her sex, nor by the incredulity that she would be capable of committing such heinous murders. He wanted her brought to Nebraska and changed. He wanted her dragged before a jury. He may also have been coming up for re-election. The day of Marie's hearing, I rode with my dad in his cruiser while Marie rode in a separate transport driven by Charlie and accompanied by Mr. Porter and my mom. The drive to St. Paul took several hours, and by the time we arrived, I was already sweating through my good church shirt. One hearing would decide whether Marie would stay in Minnesota or be transported back to Nebraska. It would decide whether my part in the story was just beginning or whether Marie and the bloodless murders would vanish from Black Deer Falls as abruptly as they came. My dad found a parking space down the street, and I got out and looked up at the Ramsey County Courthouse, a tower of golden limestone with rows of windows running down it like silver ribbons. There was a flurry of black cars and reporters between us and the entrance. "What am I doing here, Dad?" I asked. I had no experience in interrogation. I had never taken a confession. I was a would-be journalist who had delivered papers and chatted with a local editor. "You don't have to do this, Michael," my dad said. "Not any of it." But I did, didn't I? For Steve and his family and for the other victims we hadn't known. Marie Catherine Hale had to talk. Whoever had cut the bloody trail through 4 states was still out there. She was the only person alive who knew who he was. I took a breath and walked towards the crowd of people that stretched down the street and even across the street, flooding the sidewalk that looked across the Mississippi River to Harriet Island. The city smelled like exhaust, and from farther away of something fried in butter and the meaty whiff of a hamburger. My stomach rumbled, but I couldn't have eaten a bite. There were so many reporters. When we reached them, their car doors cracked open and they spilled out around us like eager insects. Pilsen had said it would be a quiet hearing, but I would come to learn that Benjamin Pilsen loved the press. "Is it true she was found alone and covered in blood? Were the bodies bled like those kids in Wisconsin? Had they been bound? What about the baby?" Cameras flashed right after the questions, as if the questions were important and were only meant to rattle us, to coax out the perfect expressions of horror. Then, just as quickly as they'd come, they disappeared, pushing and shoving back towards the street. Marie had arrived. The papers hadn't published any photos of her yet. They couldn't, as no one had been able to verify her identity, so the country hadn't been able to paint any kind of picture. Was she pretty, ugly, poor? No one could say, but that would change. The photo that everyone came to associate with Marie Catherine Hale was taken as she walked into the courthouse. She looked different in her court clothes, a mid-length black skirt belted at the waist, a white blouse with long sleeves, and a dark green sweater draped over her shoulders. Her hair was tied back with what would become her signature black ribbon, and she was helped along by an escort of Edwin Porter on one side and my mother on the other. My mom was well prepared for a task. She used one hand to fend off reporters and kept the other clamped onto Marie's thin elbow. Marie flinched and pulled a little in her grip as she shied away from the flashing bulbs. Later, the photos would show a very pretty, somewhat reluctant girl with a fashionable hairstyle and carefully done makeup. A few caught her gazing wistfully away towards the river. Towards better days, thought some. Towards escape, thought others. But the photograph that stuck was one of her smiling, with just one side of her mouth. It had only been a moment. A reporter had called out some silly thing, and she had smiled. But that instant would damn her in so many minds as the murderess who smiled while people lay dead. In the photos, her lips appeared dark. They were often called crimson. "Where'd she get the lipstick?" I asked. "Your mother gave it to her," my father said, a bit dazedly. "She got her ready for the trip. I didn't know your mother owned a lipstick like that." Inside the courthouse, the frenzy of reporters was worse. "A regular circus," my dad said. "They're only doing their jobs," I replied. But the look in their eyes were as quick and blank as a bird's hunting for bugs in the grass. Inside the courtroom, we took seats behind our prosecutor, Mr. Norquist, who had come to represent the interest of the people of Minnesota, a formality since he had already agreed to Marie's request. Marie's lawyer, Mr. Porter, sat behind him, and Marie would have the final chair. "You doing all right, Michael?" Mr. Norquist asked me. "Yes, sir." "Good. You shouldn't need to say anything more than 'Yes, Your Honor,' should the judge ask you something." He nodded to Benjamin Pilson when he came in and took his seat on the opposite side. Pilson just smiled, lines going deep into the sides of his mouth. It was a closed hearing, cobbled together and as informal as could be wrangled. But it felt plenty formal to me, and after the buzzing crush of the street and the interior of Memorial Hall, my fingers twitched to loosen my tie. "So," the judge said and folded his hands together, "all of you are here to fight over who gets to prosecute this little girl first." "That's a bit of a mischaracterization, Your Honor," Mr. Norquist said. "We, all of us in every state, wish to get to the bottom of this." "All right." The judge studied some papers. "And Wisconsin and Iowa agree that Minnesota can take the first crack at it. But not you, Mr. Pilson?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Pilson said. "And why is that? Nebraska isn't even the state where the most murders occurred." That dubious honor went to Iowa. "So why take her back there? Simply because it's where it all began?" "Yes, Your Honor. Because, since Nebraska is where it all began, we feel certain that Marie Catherine Hale is from our state. That she is a daughter of Nebraska." "A Nebraska daughter," the judge mused. "Subject first to Nebraska discipline." Pilson handed a sheaf of photographs to the bailiff. The judge looked through them as Pilson described them at length. Peter Knupp, a lifelong resident of Loop City, Nebraska, only 26 years old. He worked night shifts as a mechanist and had recently purchased his first home. On the morning of August 3rd, he was found on the front porch of that home, laid out and bleeding and bled like a hog. Cuts at his throat and the interior of his thigh. Angelina Hawk, 22, found beside her good friend Beverly Nordell, also aged 22. They were discovered sitting upright in the driver's and passenger seats of Miss Hawk's car with their throats slit. The judge pursed his lips and set down the photos. "We've all heard these facts before. We've read about these heinous and vicious acts and agree that they were heinous and vicious. Is that the only point you're trying to make?" Our prosecutor, Mr. Nyquist, stood. "Your Honor, the fact is Marie Catherine Hale was apprehended in Minnesota, covered in the victim's blood, and it is in Minnesota that she has agreed to confess her level of involvement, to give these families the sort of truth and provide the country with answers regarding the impossible nature of these crimes." The judge paused. Mr. Norquist had said the magic word. Answers. Answers were what we craved, even more than justice. Why hadn't they struggled? How had he done it? And where? Where was all the blood? "I've been informed there is ample evidence tying these new killings to others," the judge said. We do know they're connected. More blood was found on this young lady, after all, than at any of the other crime scenes combined. "Her fingerprints and some footprints have now been identified at other scenes," Pilson affirmed. "But no evidence of everyone else? A larger, stronger perpetrator?" "No, Your Honor. And now she wishes to recount the events of the killings to one young," he looked down at his papers, "Michael Jensen." "Which is a ridiculous notion," Pilson began, but the judge silenced him. "I think it's time to hear from the girl in question. Miss Hale?" Marie looked up. Yes, sir. Why would you want to give your statement in this way? She looked at Mr. Pilson. He wants to say I killed them when I didn't. And do you understand that anything you say during the investigation can be used against you in a court of law? Yes, sir. And do you understand that under this agreement you have been offered no protections against further prosecution, no deals, and may become subject to punishment depending upon what is discovered through your statements? Marie hesitated again, this time for much longer. I just want to tell my story, and for him not to be able to kill me for something I didn't do. Kill you? The judge asked and looked to Pilson. Your Honor, in the state of Nebraska, one does not need to be the perpetrator of a murder in order to be convicted of felony murder, Mr. Pilson said, and the conviction may constitute a sentence of capital punishment. The judge blinked. The death penalty? We were all silent. Marie was so young, and a girl. Yes, Your Honor, said Pilson. And just so there is no future confusion on the part of Miss Hale, I want it known that I believe the state of Nebraska has a right to justice on behalf of these young people whose lives have been cruelly taken. Marie's attorney, Mr. Porter, stood quickly, skidding his chair slightly across the marble floor. Your Honor, are we discussing execution for a girl who's still willing to fully cooperate? As she sees fit, Pilson said. She's only cooperating as she sees fit. She is 15 years old, Mr. Porter said. Nearly 16, based on the birth date she has provided. Not that we've been able to verify it or to find record in any state of a person by the name of Marie Catherine Hale. He leafed through his papers as he might suddenly find some. Yet the state of Minnesota is ready to accept whatever tale this alleged murderer wants to tell. When she stands accused of participating in the willful slaughter of 15 individuals, including a father, mother, and a son killed with their youngest daughter watching. I heard that Minnesota was a kind part of the country, but perhaps kind was the wrong word. Perhaps the word is foolhardy. My dad gave a soft, annoyed snort. I expected that the judge would remind Mr. Pilson that he was standing before a Minnesota court. He turned his attention to Marie. Miss Hale? Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand that you are entitled to a defense and are in no way obligated to admit to any involvement or wrongdoing prior to your trial? I don't want there to be a trial. Do you mean then to enter a plea of guilty and waive your right to a trial by a jury of your peers? No, sir. I only want to tell Michael what happened. Miss Hale, how exactly are you acquainted with Michael Jensen? He's the sheriff's son. He was there when I was brought in. He's visited me a couple of times. Has he made you any promises, coerced you in any way? No, sir. And you, he said to me, Mr. Jensen, are you willing to undertake the recording of Miss Hale's accounting, knowing the grievous responsibility it entails? I am, Your Honor. Your Honor, said Marie, all I ask is to stay at the jail in Black Deer Falls and tell my story to who I choose. I don't want anything else. The judge looked at Marie sadly, like he thought she was making a mistake. Why not tell an adult, he asked. Mr. Porter, even that nice lady behind you. He gestured to my mother. Because, sir, she replied, I know I'm young, but I've been around long enough to know that you can't really trust adults. Sweetheart, that's not true. I only want to tell Michael. But why? Because he's the only one who will believe me. The judge waited a long time until he was sure she wouldn't be moved. Counselors approached. Pilson and Mr. Nutquist went, with poor Mr. Porter hurrying behind. Mr. Porter would tell me later that he had bargained for all he was worth, that nothing swayed the Nebraska DA except the dangling of a bigger fish. If Marie gave up her accomplice and he was subsequently convicted, Mr. Pilson would lobby his governor to spare Marie's life. Marie Catherine Hale, the judge said, it is the decision of this court that you be granted your request. In Minnesota, you were requested, and in Minnesota you were arrested, and in Minnesota you will stay. Pilson scowled. The state of Nebraska would ask that it be allowed to appoint its own investigators to verify whatever claims are made by the accused. You spent your taxpayers' money however you see fit, Mr. Pilson. Mr. Porter cleared his throat. And should Miss Hale's confession lead to the capture or arrest of the primary prosecutor, we would argue for leniency in sentencing. Mr. Porter, that is an arrangement for another day. The judge banged his gavel and Mr. Porter shrank. Over the years that he had been our prosecutor, I'd seen him go before Judge Vernon lots of times, but that day he seemed rattled, like he had never pled a case. As we walked out of the building, well behind Marie and the throng of reporters, I heard Pilson call my name. "Young Michael Jensen," he said, and shook my hand. "Yes, sir." "Thank you for coming here today, son." He smiled. It was all ease and no hard feelings. "I guess I'll see you back in Black Deer Falls." He walked away. We passed him again in front of the courthouse surrounded by reporters. "He's coming to Black Deer Falls?" I asked. "By the time all this is over, I expect he'll nearly be a legal resident," quipped Mr. Porter, and my dad chuckled. Mr. Porter looked at me regretfully. "Kidding aside," he said, "you know this is only just beginning. It isn't just justice that hangs in the balance. It's Marie Hale's life. None of this is going to be easy, or fast." He was right about that. Marie Catherine Hale would be with us into the winter, until she was transferred to Lincoln for her trial and execution. "Something else on your mind, Ed?" my dad asked. "You seem uneasy." "I suppose I am. There's something about Marie, something that hasn't quite sat right." "What's that?" my dad asked. "She has never once indicated that she's sorry."